The presentation of anarchism as social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race. The emancipation.
Anarchist Essays is brought to you by Loughborough University's Anarchism Research Group. For more information on the ARG, see the link in the show notes or follow us on Twitter at ARGLBORO.
Afterword to the book Fight for a New Normal, Anarchism and Mutual Aid in the COVID-19 Pandemic Crisis, edited by Jim Donaghey. A Fight Within, Against and Beyond Normativity by Rhiannon Firth. In this afterword, I engage with some themes that have been covered in the book in a way that looks forward to the kinds of crises and struggles that anarchists might face in the future, riffing off the title, Fight for a New Normal. A book like this on mutual aid and anarchist responses to COVID-19 is more important than ever. Although COVID-19 is coming to feel more and more like an historical event, it is undeniable that the effects of the pandemic are ongoing. People are still dying, not only from the virus itself, but from its economic aftermath. We have been catapulted straight into a new cost of living crisis, where food security, even in the world's richest nations, is no longer assured for huge swathes of the population. The ongoing pandemic, financial crisis, and climate crisis all intersect to create multiple compounding disasters, while the risk of future pandemics is magnified by the effects of climate change, human displacement, and decreasing biodiversity. Disasters under capitalism have greater impact upon the poorest and most marginalized members of society, and they also intensify inequalities and render more people precarious. These people themselves are then cast as dangerous and are securitized against. Disasters often result in intensifying government authoritarianism. We see a hardening of borders and the criminalization of protest and lifestyles. In this context, the phrase new normal has sent shivers down my spine since I first heard it used to describe the pandemic era of reduced social interaction during 2020. A normal declared by government and media elites in a crisis is unlikely to be a democratic normal. I certainly don't remember being asked. The activities that were being newly normalized during the pandemic were those essential to capitalism. Work, schooling, and shopping were prioritized over seemingly irrevocable aspects of the old normal, such as socializing, using public park amenities, and attending funerals. As Jim Donaghey recounts in the introduction, protesting and organizing to meet needs beyond capital were further securitized against and criminalized. Public health discourse was conflated with morality in calls for greater controls, behavior shaming, and little acknowledgement that access to the goods being moralized, such as a safe home, protective equipment and water, an educated understanding of vaccines, or affective trust in state-led health policy, was the realm of the privileged. Just like old news, new normal is an oxymoron, which could be amusing in some contexts, but less so when accompanied by a slew of draconian policies and money grabs. A norm is a standard embodying a judgment about what should be the case. Normative statements are the purpose of law and politics, which institutionalize norms as to what should and should not be done. And it is also the purpose of political theory to uncover explicit or implicit normative judgments within practical discourse, or to formulate new normative positions, while everyday discourse often attaches normative weight to behaving normally. Thus, we find anarchists and other anti-capitalist radicals mobilizing the phrase, "This is not normal," as a protest slogan on placards. To borrow Ruth Kinner's phrasing in the foreword, normality is a hurrah and not a boo concept. Although rather than being one the state borrows or co-opts from anarchism, it seems to be one that anarchism borrows from the state. The idea of an anarchist new normal seems much more appealing, and in this volume we have seen many of the ways that anarchist groups struggled within, against, and beyond the state capitalist new normal to create spaces of mutual aid and possibility, prefiguring a more caring future. Nevertheless, I would like to playfully kick back against the idea embedded in the title that any kind of normal is worth fighting for, even an anarchist new normal. I would argue this idea ought to be questioned by anarchists. I want to problematize not just specific norms associated with the capitalist normal and the normative weight that is attached to behaving normally, but furthermore suggest that mutual aid suggests that we attempt to suspend normative judgment per se. The ethical relation, in anarchist terms mutual aid, proceeds from contemplating directly the needs of the other, another that is ultimately unknowable and irreducible, rather than from any transcendental ethical system. Max Stirner's work is important in this regard, and his oft-maligned critique of normativity, or spooks, helps us think through the ways in which false or fixed beliefs can render our relationships with ourselves and with others inauthentic. Practices of representation and the imposition of norms are the foundations of alienation because they create separation between a person and the selves or relationship that they have the potential to create. Because the other is essentially unknowable, any urge to assume or impose norms as part of a social relation is therefore potentially oppressive, and indeed is the essence of the embryonic state, as also argued by Landauer and James Scott. Human beings and their needs and desires are diverse and variable in ways that are barely understood. Even where norms may be collectively decided at one point in time, in a crisis, people's normal coping mechanisms break down. So attempts to impose norms become at best ineffective and at worst oppressive. Mutual aid from this perspective might be reconceived not as a duty or obligation or even as selfless altruism, but as an embodied practice that aligns with the senses, with desire and with joyful experiences of connection and empathy. In a gift relation, the giver will often say, "It's a pleasure." Tim Waterman argues that prefigurative politics is not, or not only, about how anarchist societies organize themselves or what they build, but primarily it is about exploring what we value. This is fundamentally a matter of taste and the senses. One can only truly know what one desires and enjoys by experiencing it, while at the same time there is an important role for acquired taste, that is, learned, constructive, and additive, contextual and associative, but not necessarily intentional. I think that understanding social relations as a process of harmonization of tastes and values across difference that goes beyond socially instituted norms is an important one for anarchism. There is a danger that any anarchist system that relies too heavily on norms or discourses of the normal could also alienate and other the symptoms produced by the constitutive exclusions of the normal. We see this in Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which surprisingly, given the author's usual alignment with anarchism, portrays an anarchist world that appears to stifle creativity and joy in an atmosphere of stultifying norms. The rigid intellectual atmosphere of Anarchy normatively discourages risk, creativity, and the advancement of scientific knowledge. It is an ambiguous utopia indeed. Alongside the need to denaturalize the role of norms in any future anarchist utopia, radicals must be vigilant to the increasingly decentralized technologies of surveillance and control, which even appear to mimic anarchist forms of organization, co-opted by governments and corporate technocrats into their authoritarian webs. For example, the smartphone app Olio facilitates neighbours to advertise free and low-cost food and non-food items for local collection that would otherwise have gone to waste. The gifting element and emphasis on sustainability chime with anarchist concerns, and the app's popularity has ridden upon the pandemic wave of mutualism, mobilising the discourse and ethos of mutual aid and community sharing. However, it is noteworthy that the app is structured in a gamified manner, with participants rating one another from 1 to 5 stars. The in-app forums are replete with complaints about people not following protocol and pylons calling for users to be banned from the app, which, I emphasise, relies primarily on unpaid labour to redistribute food. This is a capitalist prefiguration of a society based on social credit systems, where people may be excluded not only from an app, but from the ability to participate in economic and social life entirely. Anarchists would do well to face up to this crisis of the disposability of people. I would like to reframe some of the chapters in this book by emphasising aspects that speak to a fight against, or at least a critical relation towards, normativity as such, rather than a fight to create a new normal and to celebrate the ways in which mutual aid might be conceived as a relationship without measure. In chapter 1, Aidan and Sam say that mutual aid is a relationally transformative experience. And in chapter 4, Christopher Morales argues it is a relationship characterized mostly by spontaneity. For Imre Papanau, in chapter 3, mutual aid is responsive and radically altruistic, in the sense that it is responding to a need or filling a gap, and doubles as a political act rooted in solidarity and compassion for others. In chapter 2, Katja Lakovitz talks about how the alternative organizational form of the cooperative, which discourages organizational hierarchy, is more suited to humane interaction, mutuality, and disalienation of workers. Thomas Swan, in chapter 5, considers themes around harmonization across difference, imagining organizational structures that might enhance rather than subjugate participants' autonomy. As Ruth Kinner argues in the foreword, there is a crucial difference between mutual aid in its radical sense and the attempts of governments to mobilise mutual aid as a low-cost stand-in for the erstwhile welfare state. The radical vision of mutual aid responds to and fills gaps in human needs that are perceived and communicated empathically and through unmediated relations. The co-opted vision of mutual aid seeks to fill gaps in a failing system, a capitalist system that is in fact characterised by constant crises, yet mobilises a discourse of normalcy in order to other its own disasters. In chapter 7, John Bigger shows the cruelty implicit in treating people generically. In this case, a normal profit-seeking rational individual obliged to calculate and regulate their own exposure to risk on a supposedly but not actually level playing field, and where risk means exposure to death at the whims of the market, which is, of course, beyond individual control. Ellis Fox, in chapter 10, also argues that one-size-fits-all treatments associated with an austere statist approach to mental health care are injurious. In chapter 11, Lainey Lennox offers an account from personal experience of the stress and burnout that can result from attempting to live by a set of societal rules and expectations of a neurotypical world, when one experiences life in ways that are divergent from the supposed norm. In chapter 12, Rowan Tallis Milligan shows how the historical normalization of nuclear familial relations, as well as the use of generic policy prescriptions, can be oppressive for women, at the very least metaphorically locking them into stultifying social roles, and at worst locking them in with abusers. Normalization also risks silencing or othering dissent, and the dynamics of the state's racialization, securitization, and criminalization of movements are vividly recounted in Neil Middleton's chapter 8. It is essential that we become aware of our own complicity and avoid replicating these dynamics in our own movements. In my own research, for example, an interviewee recounted how their mutual aid group became more like a neighbourhood watch group, with some of the less radical members having to be talked out of calling the police on a group of racialised youth and on workers for supposedly breaking lockdown rules. As Daria Rustamova shows in Chapter 9, this dynamic has not only ideological but also massive material weight behind it, as budgets for counter-terrorism, increasingly aimed at domestic insurgents, including left-wing activists, have been prioritised over the funding of social goods like medical equipment and community education projects. The real danger of this dynamic is that policing and surveillance will be outsourced to technologies and communities in ways that may appear more decentralised, autonomous, participatory, democratic, and even anarchistic, but in fact are moving closer to totalitarianism. This form of authority operates through shaming, moral panic, and the social enforcement of norms. In conclusion, I invite the reader to shift perspective on this book from a fight for a new normal to a fight within, against, and beyond normativity, even if it is less catchy. This is a project of continually questioning those norms which we adopt, reproduce, and perpetuate, of thinking through how we might develop new forms and tastes that are less alienated, more embodied and empathic, and informed by our senses and direct relationships. As such, I echo Ruth Kinner's call to sustain mutual aid based on anarchist principles. Her distinction between organisational principles and ethical ones, I would argue, is fundamental to this. Mutual aid is first and foremost an ethical relation which defies the will to control or subsume the other within a set organisational structure or a set of norms. It is about exploring new values and tastes together, enjoying the sensed and felt aspects of giving and connection, and in the embodiment of our desires in prefigurative communities and ethical relations beyond the state, capitalism, and externally imposed norms.
Thank you for listening. To help others find anarchist essays, please rate and review us wherever you find your podcasts. And if you're interested in anarchist ideas, why not check out the journal Anarchist Studies? For over 20 years, Anarchist Studies has been publishing original research on the history, theory, and practice of anarchism. For more information, visit www.lwbooks.co.uk/anarchist-studies.